man kneels in the dark and his fingers are wet, but it isn't holy water. They're slick with the juice of stolen fruit. Not because he's hungry, not because he's poor, not because anyone forced him. He steals pears just to feel the thrill of rotting inside on purpose, then throws most of them to pigs like trash. And in that sticky, sour, sweet moment, he discovers something horrifying. The human heart can crave evil for no reason at all. That's the hook. That's the stain. And the twist is this. The same boy becomes one of the most revered saints in Christian history, an African father of the church, whose words cross deserts, oceans, and centuries, and are still loved in places like Nigeria today. So if you've ever wondered how a mind that sharp can be so dirty, how a soul can be so lost and still be found, stay with me, because this story isn't a straight line upward. It's a spiral, and it starts in North Africa, in the heat and dust of a Roman world that looks civilized, until you smell it up close. Aurelius Augustine is born in the year 354 in a small town called Thagaste. Today it sits in modern Algeria, but in his day it's the edge of an empire. Rome's language, Rome's laws, Rome's pride, and Rome's hypocrisy all pressed into African soil. His household is split like a wound that never closes. His mother, Monica, fierce, praying, stubborn, belongs to the Christian faith, the kind that fasts and weeps and begs God to notice. His father, Patricius, is a pagan, ambitious, hot-tempered, impressed by status, and far more interested in his son's success than his son's soul. And the boy is a blade. He learns quickly, too quickly. Words come to him like water, memory, rhythm, argument. He absorbs it all, and the adults around him start speaking about him the way people speak about an investment. He will be somebody. But even early, there's a problem inside him that no one knows how to treat. He's brilliant and restless. His mind wants to conquer, but his heart wants to taste. When Augustine remembers his childhood later, he doesn't romanticize it. He doesn't paint himself as innocent. He does something more unsettling. He admits that even as a child, he could already feel the crookedness. He lies. He bullies. He wants attention. He wants to win. He wants to be praised more than he wants to be good. And he also learns something painful, something that marks his whole life. He's beaten for mistakes in school. Adults who preach virtue strike him in anger. Teachers praise education, but teach it with humiliation. And Augustine starts to notice the contradiction that will haunt him. People can speak about truth while loving power more than truth. Still, Monica prays. Not politely, not vaguely. She prays like someone wrestling an invisible animal. She wants her son baptized, claimed early, marked as God's. She wants to protect him from what she can already sense in him, the hunger, the vanity, the deep itch for pleasure. But Augustine grows up in a world where pleasure is a currency. To advance, he must learn rhetoric, the art of persuasion, the ability to make an argument sound beautiful, even if it's wrong. This is Roman social power, the kind that opens doors and makes men bow their heads. If you can speak well, you can climb. So Patricius scrapes and struggles and finds funding, pulling strings, borrowing dignity from neighbors because he wants his son to reach Carthage, the glittering city of education and temptation. Before Carthage, Augustine tastes the first sharp tang of the thing that will both elevate and poison him: praise. He discovers that words can win love. Words can win admiration. Words can win the illusion of superiority. And soon, he doesn't just want to know, he wants to dominate. And then comes adolescence. Messy, feverish, humiliating. His body wakes up like a beast. His mind, already proud, now has fuel. He describes this season later as a storm, not a gentle coming of age, a storm. And in the middle of it, his father sees something and celebrates. Augustine has the physical signs that he's becoming a man. Patricius is thrilled as if his son's sexuality is proof of success. Monica, meanwhile, trembles. She's afraid, not of Augustine's body itself, but of what he'll worship through it. Because Augustine doesn't merely desire, he attaches. He throws himself into wanting the way some people throw themselves into war. And then, Carthage. Imagine the city as Augustine meets it. Loud streets, shouting vendors, perfume over sweat, political gossip, laughter that turns sharp. Theaters full of spectacle, students proud of their cleverness, and a constant undertow of lust. Carthage is education with teeth. Here Augustine studies. He excels, he's admired, and he falls. He plunges into what he later calls a cauldron of immoral loves. Not a single mistake. A whole lifestyle. Night after night, appetite after appetite, the brain rationalizing while the body drags him forward. This isn't the cheap version of sin where someone is simply bad. Augustine is worse than that. He's articulate. He can justify himself. He can make vice sound like sophistication. He can turn corruption into a philosophy of freedom. He wants to belong. So he joins groups of young men who take pride in cruelty. They laugh at purity. They insult anyone who seems soft. They brag about conquests. And yes, this is where that pear story happens. One night, he and his friends raid a neighbor's tree. The pears are not even good. He admits that. They're not sweet. Not worth the theft. They don't eat them with gratitude. They don't need them. They steal because it's forbidden. Because the act itself tastes like power. Because doing wrong together feels like fellowship. Because there's a sick delight in becoming the kind of person who can cross a line and laugh. And when he remembers it, he doesn't frame it as a cute prank. He frames it as a confession of the grotesque. The heart can love darkness just because it is darkness. It's a disgusting little scene. Boys with stolen fruit, sticky hands, laughter too loud, throwing the evidence away like it meant nothing. And it meant everything. Because it reveals Augustine's central wound. He's not just tempted by pleasure. He's tempted by rebellion, by the thrill of placing his own will above the good. Now here's where the rivalry enters, like a shadow behind him. Augustine is hungry for truth, he really is. Even in his mess, he's not satisfied with surface-level pleasure. He wants meaning. He wants answers big enough to match his mind. But Christianity, as he first meets it, looks embarrassing. In Carthage, the Bible is read in plain language, not polished like Roman literature, not impressive like the speeches that win applause. The scriptures feel, to him, like a humble hut compared to the marble palace of classical authors. And Augustine, intoxicated with pride, can't stand the thought of kneeling in a hut. So when a rival voice comes whispering, slicker, more flattering, more intellectually seductive, he listens. Manichaeism spreads like a fashionable infection among educated young people. It offers a cosmic drama, light versus darkness, spirit versus matter. It claims to explain evil with a tidy system. It gives Augustine something Christianity has not yet given him. The feeling of being smart. This is the enemy, an elegant competitor for his loyalty. Manichaeism tells him, you are not the problem. Your body is the problem. The universe is split. You are a victim of forces. And Augustine, already restless, already guilty, already tired of Monica's tears, finds this idea unbelievably convenient. Because if evil is a substance in the world, not a twisting of the will, then Augustine can stop looking at his own hands. He can stop smelling the pear juice. He can blame the darkness out there. And he throws himself into it for years. Not casually, but passionately. He becomes what they call a hearer, an eager student of their teachings. He debates. He argues. He impresses others. He feels clean, cleaner than he deserves. Monica is devastated. She pleads. She warns. She cries until her face is swollen. She prays until prayer becomes her posture. Augustine, meanwhile, doesn't just reject her faith, he rejects her authority. And that's another twist in this story. The future saint begins as a man who can wound the holiest person in his life without flinching. But even in his rebellion, he's not at peace. Because he wants pleasure, yes, but he also wants love that will not leave. And this is where Augustine's private life turns heavy. He takes a concubine, an unofficial partner, socially acceptable in the Roman world if you're not ready for a respectable marriage, and he truly loves her. Not in a neat way, not in a pure way, but it's real attachment. They live together. They build a life, and a child is born, a son, Adeodatus, whose name means gift of God. Imagine the irony of that name in Augustine's mouth at that stage. A gift of God, born inside a household that refuses God's rule. But Augustine is not ready to change, not ready to submit. He loves his son, he loves his partner, and he also loves ambition, applause, and the ability to do what he wants without anyone judging him. So he keeps studying, keeps climbing. He becomes a teacher of rhetoric, the very skill Rome worships, and he becomes disgusted, not with himself, at first, with his students. In Carthage, the students are famous for being wild. They heckle, they riot, they make games of humiliating teachers. They treat education like a sport where the goal is dominance. Augustine begins to feel something he doesn't expect: contempt. He sees that the world he wanted so badly is full of posturing children wearing adult clothes, and he begins to suspect that he is one of them. So he leaves Carthage and heads to Rome, believing that Rome will be better, more disciplined, more serious, more worthy of him. This is classic Augustine, always convinced the next place will cure him. Rome is colder, more calculating, less chaotic, but no less corrupt. Here's one of the sharpest disappointments. In Rome, the students are polite and dishonest. They flatter you, then skip out on paying tuition. They smile while cheating you. It's a different flavor of rot. And Augustine, who can argue circles around most men, finds himself trapped in something he can't debate his way out of: the emptiness of a life built on winning. He's still committed to Manichaeism, but cracks are spreading through the system. He's too intelligent not to notice contradictions. He keeps hearing about a star figure, a champion of their movement, an admired teacher whose name is spoken like a promise: Faustus. Faustus is supposed to be the one, the answer man. The mind that will silence doubts, the brilliant rival voice who will outshine the humble scriptures and finally satisfy Augustine's hunger for truth. Augustine waits for him with a kind of desperate anticipation. This is not mere curiosity. This is Augustine searching for permission to remain who he is. Because if Faustus is great enough, Augustine can stay in the orbit of Manichaeism and call it wisdom. And when Faustus finally arrives and Augustine meets him, Faustus is charming, smooth, confident. But something is off. He speaks beautifully, of course he does. Yet when Augustine presses him, when he asks the hard questions about astronomy, about logic, about the mechanics of their cosmology, Faustus glides, he dances, he avoids, he dazzles without answering. It's like biting into a fruit that looks rich and tastes like water. This is a turning point, and it's cruel, because Augustine realizes that rhetoric, his own weapon, his own craft, can be used to hide ignorance. He recognizes his own reflection in Faustus, a man who can make emptiness sound full. And suddenly, the enemy doesn't look like a grand demon. It looks like a handsome speaker smiling while your soul starves. Augustine does not leave Manichaeism immediately. Pride rarely releases its prey in one clean moment. But a seed of disillusionment lodges in him and begins to grow. He takes a prestigious job opportunity, a post in Milan, the imperial city in the West. It is success. It is everything Patricius would have dreamed of, everything Augustine once thought would satisfy him. But here's the truth. By the time Augustine reaches this new height, the inner tension has become unbearable. He has climbed, and the view doesn't heal him. He is famous enough to be seen, clever enough to be feared, and still fragile enough to be controlled by appetites he pretends are freedom. And somewhere behind him, far away in Africa, Monica hears where her son has gone. She doesn't celebrate his promotion. She follows him. Not as a fan, not as a tourist. As a mother on a mission, crossing distance like a prayer given legs. She arrives with her faith intact and her eyes sharp, refusing to be impressed by titles. And Augustine, now a man, now a respected teacher, still feels that old childhood sensation when he faces her, that she sees him too clearly. Because no matter how polished his speeches are, Monica has always known there's something sour under the sweetness. something stolen, something thrown to pigs. And Augustine is about to discover that the real battlefield isn't between Christians and Manichees, or Africa and Rome, or even mother and son. It's inside his own will. And the worst part? He's starting to suspect that he's losing. Milan doesn't greet Augustine like Carthage. Carthage was a furnace. Noise, sweat, laughter that tasted like wine and regret. Milan is colder, sharper, more polished. The kind of city where power wears perfume so you don't smell the blood under it. Here, Augustine is no longer just a clever African youth arguing in classrooms. Here, he is official, a professor of rhetoric appointed to educate the empire's future elites. The words he shapes can bend careers. His voice can open doors. His reputation can walk into rooms before his body does. It's everything his ambition ever demanded. And yet, the first thing he notices is not triumph. It's a kind of nausea. Because when you finally get what you worship, you learn what it costs. And Augustine has paid with something he can't buy back. The ability to be still. His mind races even when the room is quiet. His desires flare even when he promises himself discipline. His conscience bites, then he bites it back with excuses. He can win debates, but he cannot win against his own impulses. And the enemy that has followed him from Africa into Italy is not a man with a sword. It is a voice that knows his name. It says, "You're too smart to kneel. You're too refined for that crude faith your mother loves. You can have truth without submission. You can have purity later. You can have God. Eventually. Just not now. Not now is the most seductive lie Augustine will ever hear. Monica arrives in Milan like a storm that refuses to apologize. Not glamorous, not delicate, not well-timed. She arrives with the blunt force of a mother's faith, the kind of faith that doesn't negotiate with your pride, the kind of faith that doesn't care what your colleagues think, the kind of faith that has worn grooves into its knees. She finds her son in the center of empire, and she looks at him the way she looked at him when he was a child, as if the titles are clothing, and she can see the body underneath. In Milan, Monica attaches herself to the local church community, and she begins attending the sermons of a man whose name moves through the city like a blade through fabric. Ambrose. Bishop Ambrose of Milan is not what Augustine expects. Augustine expects Christians to sound simple, uneducated, embarrassing, like peasants reading holy stories in clumsy language. Ambrose is not clumsy. Ambrose is dangerous. Because Ambrose can do what Augustine respects most. He can speak beautifully. He can interpret scripture with intelligence. He can take passages Augustine had dismissed as childish and reveal a depth that feels humiliating. Ambrose doesn't merely preach. He out-argues Augustine without even aiming at him. This becomes Augustine's new rivalry. Not a screaming street debate, not a brawl of insults. A silent intellectual war fought inside Augustine's skull, where every sermon is a strike against his pride. Augustine comes at first for the rhetoric, for the craft, the technique, the elegance. He tells himself he's studying Ambrose like a professional, studies another professional. But the words start slipping past his defenses. And worse, Ambrose doesn't treat questions the way Manichaeism did. Manichaeism had promised Augustine a clean explanation of evil, light versus darkness, good substance versus bad substance. A neat cosmic story where Augustine's own responsibility could be blurred. Ambrose doesn't give him a neat story. Ambrose gives him a mirror. He teaches Augustine how Christians can read Scripture not only literally, but also spiritually. How the text can have layers. How what seemed crude can be profound. He addresses the very objection that kept Augustine away. This book is unworthy of my mind. And Augustine, the proud rhetorician, begins to realize something awful. Maybe the Bible wasn't beneath him. Maybe he was too vain to understand it. Still, the old enemy doesn't retreat easily. The Manichees in Milan know who Augustine is. They know he is influential. They know he is sharp. And they want him loyal. They want him as their trophy. An African intellectual at the heart of empire, proof that their movement is the religion of the educated. Augustine feels their pull. He also feels their weakness now. After the disappointment of Faustus, after the growing cracks. But leaving isn't simple, because he has built a life around being right. To convert would mean admitting he had been wrong publicly for years. Pride doesn't just fear God. Pride fears embarrassment. At the same time, a second chain tightens around him. His private life. Augustine is still with the woman who has shared his bed and home for years, the concubine he loved, the mother of Adeodatus. She is not a footnote. She is history. She is comfort. She is a rhythm his body knows better than prayer. But Monica has other plans. Monica wants Augustine married properly to a socially suitable girl, someone who matches his rising status. A respectable alliance, a clean future. And Augustine, this is where the story turns ugly, agrees. Not because he suddenly becomes moral, but because he wants the benefits of respectability without the sacrifice of desire. So he makes a decision that slices his household in half. He sends his partner away. Imagine the scene not as a theological concept, but as a human wound. A woman who has lived with him, loved him, borne his child, and now being told she must leave because she doesn't fit the future he wants. She is not good enough for his career. She is not proper enough for his mother's vision. And the worst part? Augustine later admits she leaves vowing never to be with another man. She leaves bleeding inside. And Augustine, who will one day write about love, grace, and the human heart, does not immediately become noble. He collapses. He tries to replace her. He takes another woman temporarily because he can't bear the silence of his own body. He can't bear the emptiness of a bed that no longer contains the familiar weight. This is one of the most revolting truths about him, and it's important. Augustine is not redeemed because he is naturally pure. He is redeemed because he finally becomes honest about how enslaved he is. He is in Milan, dressed in success, and inside he is still a captive. And now he has an additional torment. The proposed respectable bride is young, so young she isn't even old enough to marry yet. There will be a waiting period. Augustine, meanwhile, is a man whose will has been trained to say yes to desire immediately. He feels the trap tightening. He cannot marry yet. He cannot remain faithful. He cannot live cleanly. He cannot truly commit to God, so he is split, wanting holiness and wanting dirt. And the tension becomes so sharp, it starts to sound like two people speaking inside him. One voice says, choose God, choose clarity, choose freedom. Another voice, older, slicker, warmer, says, not yet, just one more season, one more pleasure, one more night. Then you'll change. This is not abstract. This is physiological. His skin remembers. His habits command him. His imagination flashes scenes into his mind like a theater that refuses to close. He begins reading philosophy, the Platonists, the idea of a higher reality, the concept of the immaterial good. These books do something shocking. They lift his mind upward. They help him conceive of God not as a physical substance, not as some bright material trapped in the universe, but as being itself, uncreated, unchanging, beyond matter. This becomes a twist in his journey. Pagan philosophy, which he once assumed would keep him away from Christianity, becomes a ladder that helps him understand it. His Manichaean worldview starts to crumble completely. Evil is not a thing living in matter. Evil is a distortion of will, a turning away from the good. And if that's true, Augustine can't blame the cosmos anymore. He has to blame Augustine, and he hates that. Because if the problem is his will, then the battle is not about information. It's about surrender. He begins to circle closer to Christian faith intellectually. He even becomes a catechumen, someone preparing for baptism, but he doesn't cross the line. Because there is still a rival he cannot defeat, himself. There's a moment when he speaks to a Christian friend named Simplicianus, who tells him the story of another famous intellectual conversion, how a learned man, once proud, eventually bowed and was baptized. The point is simple and brutal. Someone as smart as you has done it. Augustine feels cornered. Then another story hits him like a punch. He hears about two imperial officials who stumble upon the life of Anthony of Egypt, the desert monk, and are so struck they abandon worldly ambition on the spot. They choose God with a kind of violent decisiveness Augustine cannot imitate. Two men, one story, a sudden surrender. Augustine listens, and something in him breaks, not into peace, but into panic. Because now the question is no longer, is Christianity true? The question is, why can't I do what I know is right? He goes out into a garden, restless, shaking, furious at himself. He is with his friend Alypius, but Augustine pulls away, walking further into the garden as if distance can give him courage. And in that garden, Augustine does something he rarely does in public. He falls apart, not a dignified tear, not a poetic sadness. He sobs, he rages, he argues with himself out loud. He grips his own heart like a man trying to rip out a parasite. He recognizes the shape of his bondage. He says, in effect, I want to change, but I don't want to change. I want purity, but I love my chains. I want God, but I want my old pleasures more. He describes his old desires like they are living things, tugging at his clothes, whispering, "Do you really think you can live without us? From this moment we will never be with you again. Are you strong enough to let us die?" And that's the disgusting part. He realizes he has been treating sin like a lover. And then, at the peak of his meltdown, when his mind is a battlefield and his body is trembling, he hears a sound, a child's voice, nearby, singing or chanting something simple, something rhythmic, something that slices through his chaos like a clean knife. Take and read, take and read. In Latin, tolle, lege. It's not a normal children's song, not one he recognizes. It's strange enough to feel like a message, and ordinary enough to feel real. And Augustine freezes. He stops crying mid-breath. He stands up like someone who has just been given an order. He goes back to where Alypius is sitting, where a book of Paul's letters lies nearby. Augustine grabs it, not gently, and opens it at random, as if he is afraid his courage will evaporate if he hesitates. His eyes fall on a passage that is not soft, not vague, not poetic. It is direct like a command shouted in your face. Stop living in drunkenness, lust, and jealousy. Put on Christ. Make no provision for the flesh. Augustine reads it, and it's as if something inside him snaps, not in pain, but in release. He doesn't read further. He doesn't need to. He closes the book, and the storm that has been chewing him alive goes suddenly, terrifyingly quiet. He later describes it like light flooding his heart and doubt fleeing. But don't imagine it as a magical glow that makes life easy. Imagine it as a man who has been drowning for years, finally discovering he can stand. He tells Alypius. Alypius, moved, reads further and is struck too. The conversion becomes contagious. Then Augustine goes to Monica. How do you even describe that meeting? A mother who has prayed through years, through distance, through betrayal, through intellectual arrogance, through sexual chaos, through public success that meant nothing to her. Now hearing her son say, "I'm choosing God." Monica's joy is not neat. It's the joy of someone whose hope has been bleeding for years and somehow never died. Augustine resigns his post. He steps away from the career ladder he once treated like salvation. He withdraws with friends and family to a quiet place, Casiciacum, where the group lives a kind of in-between life, praying, discussing, preparing, letting the old identity peel off like dead skin. And then comes another twist, one that makes the story sting again. Augustine's son Adeodatus is there too, brilliant, gentle, astonishingly quick-minded. Augustine loves him deeply and speaks of him with tenderness. The boy is not just the child of sin. He is a living reminder that even in Augustine's mess, love existed. Augustine prepares for baptism, not as a triumphant hero, but as a man who knows how filthy his hands have been. At Easter in 387 in Milan, Ambrose baptizes Augustine, along with Alypius and also Adeodatus. Think about the symbolism. The mother's prayers, the bishop's preaching, the philosopher's searching, the sinner's collapse in a garden. The child's voice chanting, "Take and read," and finally water poured over a man who has spent years pouring himself into every pleasure that couldn't satisfy him. It's not just a ritual, it's a death. The old Augustine, shiny, ambitious, self-excusing, is drowned, and a new Augustine rises, trembling, still human, still tempted, but finally aligned toward a different center. He does not leave Milan as the empire's golden teacher anymore. He leaves as a pilgrim. And as he prepares to return to Africa, he has no idea that the next phase of his life will be even more brutal. Because once you belong to God, your enemies change. The old rival, his lust, his pride, the Manichees, will not disappear overnight. They will chase him with memories and arguments. But new rivals are coming too. Men who will not try to seduce him with pleasure, but with a false holiness. Men who will say, "You don't need grace, you can save yourself." And Augustine, who knows exactly how weak the will can be, will go to war. They set out from Italy thinking they were going home. But the road out of Milan doesn't feel like a victory parade. It feels like a retreat after a private war. Faces thinner, eyes clearer, the air sharper. Augustine is baptized now, yes. But his old life still clings to him like smoke trapped in hair. And then the first blow lands, not from a rival, not from a heretic, not from an emperor, from love. At the port city of Ostia, while they wait for a ship back to Africa, Monica, who prayed him into this new life, grows weak. The woman who crossed seas for her son now cannot cross one more. Augustine sits with her near a window, and for a moment the world becomes quiet enough to hear something terrifying. The sound of time running out. They talk about heaven, about the life of the world to come, about joy that doesn't rot, about a home that can't be taken by illness or politics. Monica is calm in a way that stuns him. She tells him, in effect, that her job is finished. She wanted only one thing, and God gave it. Then she dies. Imagine what that does to Augustine's heart. The anchor is gone. The prayers that chased him across continents are suddenly silent. He grieves like a man who has been held together by someone else's faith and now has to learn to stand on his own. He tries to be strong, to keep composure, to be the converted intellectual. He even feels guilty for crying, as if tears are a weakness unworthy of a philosopher. And that guilt is the old Augustine trying to come back, still obsessed with looking impressive. But grief has a way of tearing masks off. By the time the ship carries them toward Africa, Augustine is not sailing as a young professor anymore, or even as a newly baptized celebrity convert. He is sailing as a man who has lost his mother, lost the old version of himself, and now feels a strange, frightening freedom. No one can force him to chase success anymore. So he makes a decision that feels like a twist even to him. He wants to disappear. He wants a quiet Christian life, prayer, study, community, something like a small monastery where the loudest thing in the day is a page turning. Back in North Africa, he sells what he can. He gathers like-minded friends. He begins living in a disciplined, communal way. He's not chasing fame. He's trying to keep his soul clean. But peace doesn't last. Because Augustine's story isn't the story of a man who finds God and then floats off into private holiness. It's the story of a man dragged into the arena. And the arena is a city called Hippo Regius. Augustine travels there for an ordinary reason: to persuade a friend to join their community life. Not to preach, not to become a public figure, not to lead, just a visit. But in Hippo, the church is crowded. The bishop is aging. The people are hungry for leaders. And when they see Augustine, educated, baptized, morally serious, known to be brilliant, they do something that in that world is both an honor and a kind of spiritual kidnapping. They seize him, not with chains, worse, with expectation. They call for him to be ordained a priest. Augustine is stunned. He resists. He begs. He cries, literally cries, because he knows what it means. In his mind, he can see the trap. Once you step into that role, your life will never belong to you again. The crowd insists. And Augustine, still learning the shape of surrender, lets the wave carry him. So the man who wanted silence is ordained into noise. The man who wanted to hide is placed on a platform. The man who feared his own weakness is now responsible for other people's souls. This is where the tension climbs again. Augustine has escaped the empire's career ladder only to be handed something heavier than any Roman title. In Hippo, the church isn't a polished theater of respectable citizens. It's a living organism full of crisis. There are families starving. There are merchants cheating and laughing about it. There are rumors and resentments. There are widows who need protection. There are public officials who want the church to do politics quietly. There are young men itching for violence. There are believers who can't read but can smell hypocrisy instantly. And there are rivals, powerful, organized, convinced that they are the true church. The biggest competitor in North African Christianity at the time is the Donatist movement. They aren't pagans outside the faith. That's what makes it uglier. They are Christians who claim the Catholic Church has become impure, compromised, polluted by leaders who failed under persecution. They insist only their community is truly holy. They have their own bishops, their own networks, their own martyrs, their own identity like a flag. In some towns, Donatists are the majority. In others, they fight Catholics street by street. It's not always debate. Sometimes it's intimidation, property seizures, and mobs. So Augustine is ordained into a battlefield where the enemy wears the same cross. And the Donatists have a weapon Augustine recognizes immediately: rhetoric. They can preach. They can stir crowds. They can tell a story that makes people feel pure and heroic. They can frame the Catholics as traitors. They can make division feel like virtue. Augustine's first months as a priest are brutal. He has to preach constantly, often several times a week. He has to teach scripture to people who do not care about philosophical elegance. He has to interpret faith in a way that touches daily hunger, daily shame, daily rage. He begins to speak like a man who knows he cannot hide behind cleverness anymore. His sermons are not abstract. They are alive with sweat and urgency. He paints images people can taste. Greed as a disease in the stomach, lust as a fire that eats the house, pride as a swelling that kills the heart. He speaks of Christ not as an idea, but as a physician, and the congregation as a hospital. And the twist is this: Augustine, once addicted to applause, becomes a man who fears it, because he knows he can seduce people with words. He knows he can win them and lose himself in the process. He knows how dangerous his own gift is. So he works painfully to use rhetoric as a servant instead of a master. He learns to cut his sentences shorter, sharper, more direct. He repeats key phrases so the uneducated can carry them home like bread. He invites the crowd into the text, makes scripture feel like it's happening now, in their homes, in their marketplaces, in their marriages, in their grudges. And between sermons, he does the part of ministry no one romanticizes. He sits with the grieving. He negotiates conflicts between families. He deals with people who claim visions and demand attention. He writes letters to anxious believers, to angry officials, to distant bishops. He manages church resources to feed the poor. He intervenes in legal disputes, sometimes literally stepping between violence and a victim, because the church is one of the few institutions people still fear enough to obey. In North Africa, the church can be a refuge, but it can also be a target. And Augustine becomes a target. He debates Donatist leaders publicly. He writes against their claims. He argues that the holiness of the church does not depend on the personal purity of every minister, because if it did, no one would ever have certainty. Everyone would live under suspicion. Everyone would be trapped in endless accusations. He insists the sacraments are God's action, not human magic. To Donatists, this sounds like compromise. To Augustine, it sounds like mercy. But mercy is not a popular weapon in a culture that loves purity as a badge. The rivalry escalates. Some extremists associated with the movement, violent groups in the region, turn conflict into chaos. There are stories of intimidation, and the fear in villages is real. Augustine pleads for unity, argues, persuades, and also, here's the uncomfortable twist, supports using imperial law at times to restrain. violence and pressure schismatics back toward unity. This becomes one of the most debated aspects of his legacy. The man who once hated coercion now believes, in certain circumstances, that discipline can protect souls and prevent bloodshed, and you can hear the tension inside him when he writes. He doesn't sound like a tyrant. He sounds like a pastor, afraid that division will devour the weak. Because in Augustine's Africa, theology isn't a hobby. It's a matter of identity, safety, and survival. Then, as if one conflict isn't enough, Augustine's life takes another turn. He becomes bishop. The older bishop, Valerius, recognizes Augustine's gift and also knows the city needs a strong voice. Augustine is made coadjutor, assistant bishop, then eventually succeeds him. Now, the man who wanted to disappear is responsible not only for a congregation, but for clergy formation, discipline, doctrinal unity, and leadership across a region. And he does something unexpected. He builds community. He gathers clergy into a common life, shaping them with prayer, study, and discipline. He wants leaders who aren't just performers, but shepherds. He wants hearts trained, not just tongues. His home becomes a kind of monastery for priests. And still, the inner war isn't over, because sin doesn't vanish when you get a title. Temptation evolves. Now it comes as ego. You're the defender of the faith. Now it comes as bitterness. These people are exhausting. Now it comes as despair. The church is too divided. Now it comes as exhaustion so deep it feels like spiritual numbness. Augustine responds the way he learned in that garden, not by pretending strength, but by confessing weakness and clinging to grace. And out of that inner struggle, he writes words that will outlive empires. He writes confessions, not as propaganda, but as a wound opened for the world to see. He tells the truth about his theft, his lust, his pride, his mother, his tears, his chains. Why would a bishop expose himself like that? Because Augustine knows something most people fear. If you hide your darkness, it controls you. If you drag it into the light, it loses its throne. And confessions becomes a weapon not against an external enemy, but against the illusion that holiness is a performance. It tells every sinner, every restless person, every brilliant mind addicted to itself, you are not alone, and the path back is real. But it will cost you your pride. Then history itself seems to crack. In 410, news spreads that Rome has been sacked, the eternal city, the symbol of order, the empire's pride, breached. People panic. Refugees flee across the Mediterranean. Some end up in North Africa. Fear spreads like smoke. If Rome can fall, what is safe? Pagans blame the Christians. You abandoned the old gods and now we're punished. Christians shake with doubt. If the world is collapsing, what does our faith mean? Augustine, bishop in an African port city, feels the shockwave hit his doorstep. And once again, a rival voice tries to seize the narrative. The pagan accusation is not simply intellectual, it's political, emotional, and contagious. It offers people a scapegoat that feels satisfying. Blame the new religion. Augustine chooses to fight, not with riots, not with swords, but with a book so large it feels like a fortress built out of arguments. The City of God. He answers the accusation by reframing reality itself. He tells people, in essence, Rome was never eternal. No empire is. Human glory rises and rots. What you worship collapses. That is not a scandal. It's a revelation. He describes two cities, two loves. One built on love of self to the point of contempt for God, the other built on love of God to the point of forgetting self. These cities intertwine through history, but they are not the same. So even if Rome burns, God's purpose does not. It's a twist that changes the angle of the whole catastrophe. Augustine refuses to treat Christianity as a lucky charm for empire. He refuses to promise safety as proof of truth. He offers something harder and more liberating, meaning that survives collapse. And while he writes, while he preaches, while he debates Donatists, while he guides clergy, another rival emerges. This one quieter, subtler, and in some ways more dangerous because it flatters the human ego. A British monk named Pelagius begins teaching ideas that spread through Christian circles, that human beings can, by their natural power, choose good without the kind of transforming grace Augustine describes. That moral perfection is possible through effort, that God's commands imply you already have what it takes. To many people, this sounds inspiring. It sounds empowering. It sounds clean. And that is exactly why Augustine becomes alarmed, because he knows the human will from the inside. He has lived the split, the I want to change, but I can't. He has tasted the lie of not yet. He has felt chains that no amount of willpower could break. So, when Pelagian teaching begins to influence leaders and communities, Augustine feels it as a direct threat, not just to doctrine, but to desperate souls. If people believe they can save themselves through effort, then the weak will either pretend or despair. And Augustine cannot tolerate a gospel that turns God into a coach and salvation into a trophy. So he goes to war again, not as a man eager for conflict, but as a pastor defending the wounded. He writes, argues, and presses the church to clarify that grace is not a polite bonus. It is the beginning, middle, and end of healing. He insists that even the desire to turn toward God is itself a gift, because the heart left alone can rationalize anything, can love. Darkness for its own sake, can steal pears just to feel powerful. The rivalry sharpens. Pelagius and his supporters say, human freedom is strong. You can do it. Augustine says, human freedom is real, but it is injured. Without grace, you won't even know how deep the injury goes. And what makes this conflict tense is that it doesn't look like evil wearing a horned helmet. It looks like moral optimism. It looks like be better. It looks like something social media would love: discipline, effort, self-improvement. But Augustine knows a terrifying truth. Be better can become a new kind of pride, and pride is the oldest addiction. So he keeps preaching grace in a world addicted to self-justification. Meanwhile, the daily work continues. He is constantly interrupted. People knock. Clergy argue. The poor come hungry. The angry come looking for permission to stay angry. Officials come seeking alliances. Rumors spread. Rival groups whisper. Augustine grows older inside a hurricane. And yet, in the middle of all this, he remains intensely, almost painfully human. He laughs with friends. He mourns losses. He worries. He admits fear. He confesses distraction. He fights fatigue. He begs God for help against temptation that does not vanish just because he wears a bishop's robe. There is no glossy saint glow in Augustine's own portrait of himself. There is a man holding his soul like a fragile cup in a shaking hand. And that vulnerability becomes part of why he is so powerful. He never preaches as if he's above the struggle. He preaches as a man who has been burned by his own desires and knows exactly what fire smells like. By the time Augustine is well into his years as bishop, North Africa knows him as a pillar, someone who can out-argue rivals, yes, but more importantly, someone who can interpret the faith for ordinary people in extraordinary times. He becomes a bridge between classical learning and Christian scripture, between personal confession and public leadership, between African church life and the wider world of Christianity. And quietly, something else is happening beneath the big controversies. His words are traveling, letters copied, sermons repeated, arguments recited in councils, books carried by ship. He is no longer just the Bishop of Hippo. He is becoming an African voice that the whole Christian world cannot ignore. But history is not finished with him, because another storm is rising, one that does not care about his books, his arguments, or his fame. A storm made of steel and fire. A storm that will reach Hippo itself. And in that final storm, Augustine will have to show what he truly believes about the city of God. Not on paper, but with his life. The storm doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It arrives the way disasters often do, first as rumor, then as confirmed names, then as boats in the distance, then as a knock on your city gates that makes every prayer suddenly sound less theoretical. Across the sea, the Western Empire is weakening like a sick giant. Borders are porous. Armies are unreliable. Officials bargain for time the way starving people bargain for bread. And then come the Vandals. Not as a cartoon horde, but as an organized force, ruthless, disciplined, and terrifyingly motivated. They cross into North Africa and move like a blade through the coastline towns, carving possession, burning certainty, scattering. Refugees ahead of them like sparks in wind. Hippo Regius becomes a bowl filling with fear. People flee into the city with nothing but bruises and stories. Some have seen priests killed. Some have watched homes crackle into ash. Some whisper about what the Vandals believe. They aren't pagans in the old Roman sense. They're Christians of a different stripe. Arian Christians, who deny the full divinity of Christ as the Catholic Church teaches it. That detail matters because it sharpens the horror. Again, the enemy carries the name Christian, but not the same faith. Augustine has spent decades fighting rivals inside the household of belief. Donatists with their purity politics, Pelagians with their flattering moral optimism. Now the final rival is armed, marching, and convinced that God is on their side too. And suddenly Augustine's life feels like it has been moving toward this moment all along. Because his whole story, pair theft, lust, ambition, conversion, preaching, controversy, has always been about one question. What do you cling to when everything you used to lean on collapses? Now that question is no longer a clever thought experiment for a book. It's a fire at the city's edge. Hippo braces for siege. The walls become prayer requests. The streets tighten. The air feels thinner because everyone's future is pressed into the same small space. Augustine is old now, late 70s, not frail like paper, but worn in the deep way leaders get worn. His mind is still fierce, but his body reminds him daily that he's not built for forever. And the people look to him the way desperate people always look to someone who once sounded certain. They want guarantees. They want a miracle. They want him to promise that Hippo will be spared because they have a great bishop. But Augustine refuses to sell superstition to the terrified. He does something harder. He does something colder and kinder at the same time. He tells them, the city of God is not made of stone walls. He tells them, if the city falls, your faith doesn't have to fall with it. He tells them, Christ is not a charm you rub to keep the empire intact. And that message is almost infuriating when you're hungry and surrounded, because people don't want meaning when the enemy is outside the gate. They want safety. Yet Augustine's entire theology has been training souls for exactly this moment, not to confuse God with comfort, not to confuse faith with political stability, not to confuse the church with an empire's success. Still, he is not detached. Not at all. He organizes care for refugees as resources tighten. He encourages clergy and lay leaders to keep feeding the poor as long as they can. He answers letters, guides decisions, comforts families. His house, once a disciplined community of study, becomes a triage center for a collapsing world. And here's the twist that bites. Augustine, the man who once chased applause in theaters, now spends his final months listening to the sound of war outside his city, and the sound of people's fear inside it. The older rival, pride, tries to whisper again, see, you were important. You matter. Your city depends on you. But Augustine has learned the enemy's voice too well. He won't let himself become a hero statue while people die. Instead, he asks to be given space for prayer, not as an escape, but as a final act of realism. He requests that penitential psalms be written out and placed where he can see them, words of confession and pleading, not words of triumph. This isn't a man polishing his legacy. This is a man keeping his own heart low to the ground. Imagine him there, an aging African bishop in a besieged city, listening to distant shouts and the dull percussion of siege work, eyes moving across lines of ancient poetry that speak the only honest language in a collapsing world. Mercy, forgiveness, dependence, God. And then illness takes him. Not a dramatic battlefield wound, not a martyr's spear, a sickness, slow and humiliating, the kind that makes you realize you don't get to choose the aesthetics of your ending. The city is still under pressure. The siege still grinds on. Life outside his room keeps moving like a machine. And Augustine, who wrote so much about time, memory, desire, now lies inside time's grip, watching his own strength drain away. There is no final speech preserved like a movie scene. No perfectly crafted last line. There is simply a man dying as every man dies, with breath becoming work. And in the year 430, Augustine of Hippo, Augustine the African, leaves the world. He dies while the siege is ongoing. It feels unfair. It feels unfinished. And it is exactly the kind of ending that proves his point. Human history doesn't neatly wrap itself around our narratives. Cities fall. Leaders die. Empires rot. Even saints don't get to control the plot. Soon after, Hippo is taken. The physical city does not endure like people wanted. But the city of God he described, faith anchored beyond collapse, keeps walking. Here's another twist. The Vandals can seize buildings, but they cannot seize a mind that has already been copied into books, carried in letters, memorized in prayers, and planted into generations. Augustine's enemies never fully disappear. People will argue with him for centuries. They still do. Some will accuse him of being too pessimistic about human nature. Others will say his understanding of grace is too strong, too dominating, too heavy. Some will wrestle with his stance on coercion in church disputes and find it disturbing. Others will insist he was responding to a world where violence and division were already devouring the vulnerable. Augustine is not the kind of saint you can turn into a harmless figurine. He's too honest. And that honesty is exactly why he survives. Because he doesn't just hand you rules. He hands you a diagnosis. He shows you the human heart, the way a surgeon shows you a wound, open, unpleasant, undeniable. He tells you, your problem is not just the world out there. Your problem is your love, what you cling to, what you worship, what you excuse, what you refuse to release. And he tells you, you cannot fix that wound by willpower alone. That's the point where his biggest rivalry becomes eternal. Not Donatists, not Pelagians, not Arians, not Vandals. The eternal rival is the idea that humans can save themselves without being transformed from the inside by grace. Augustine becomes, in many ways, Christianity's great anatomist of the will, describing how desire twists, how memory traps, how habit enslaves, how pride makes sin feel like freedom. And he becomes its great poet of grace, insisting that God is not a distant judge waiting for you to clean up first, but a physician who enters the room while you're still bleeding. That is why Augustine is remembered not only as a thinker, but as a spiritual companion. People read him and feel uncomfortably seen. Now, why is he honored in Nigeria? Not as a dusty European import, but as an African father whose voice still fits African soil. Nigeria is not one Christian story. It's many stories braided together. Catholic, Anglican, Pentecostal, Evangelical, Orthodox communities. Vibrant worship, deep spiritual hunger, intense moral struggle, public faith mixed with public pressure, and a daily life where questions of evil, suffering, temptation, community division, and hope are not academic. In that landscape, Augustine resonates for several reasons that are almost impossible to fake. First, he is African. That sounds simple, but it matters emotionally. Augustine is not a distant saint from a cold northern continent. He is from the same broad continent, formed in the same sun-baked world of coastal cities, trade routes, tribal memories, imperial pressures, and spiritual intensity. For many Nigerian Christians, especially those who care about reclaiming Africa's early Christian heritage, Augustine stands as proof that African Christianity is not new, not borrowed, not secondary. It has roots, deep ones, ancient ones. Second, Augustine speaks the language of inner conflict in a way that matches real life. Nigeria's Christianity often emphasizes deliverance, transformation, holiness, and the reality of spiritual struggle. Augustine doesn't mock that struggle or reduce it to psychology. He describes it as a battle of loves, a tug of war inside the will, and he does it with scenes that feel painfully familiar. I know what I should do, but I keep doing what I hate. He doesn't say that as an excuse. He says it as a confession, and then points to grace as the only real liberation. For people wrestling with addiction, sexual temptation, anger, envy, double lives, secret shame, Augustine doesn't offer cute slogans. He offers a mirror and a path. Third, he speaks powerfully into community division, which is a living wound in many places. Nigeria, like many nations with vibrant faith, has denominational rivalries, church splits, accusations of impurity or compromise, competitions for legitimacy and influence. Augustine lived in a world where Christians fought Christians fiercely. His conflict with the Donatists wasn't theoretical. It was about identity, true church claims, public violence, fractured communities. So when Nigerian Christians or clergy read Augustine, they hear someone who understands the tragedy of believers tearing each other apart while the world burns. They hear a man pleading for unity, not as a marketing strategy, but as pastoral medicine, because division destroys the vulnerable first. Fourth, Augustine's view of evil and suffering speaks to a world that has seen too much. In Nigeria, people often face real hardship, insecurity, poverty in some regions, grief, injustice, the fear of sudden loss. Augustine does not promise that faith makes history smooth. He watched an empire tremble, cities fall, refugees flood in, and violence press at the door. And instead of selling false comfort, he teaches a tougher hope. You can lose everything and still not be lost. That message, anchoring dignity and meaning beyond political stability, isn't a Western luxury. It's survival wisdom. Fifth, Augustine is honored through worship life, education, and church structure. In Nigeria, Catholic devotion includes saints' feast days, parish patron names, schools and seminaries named for saints, and religious orders that shape education and pastoral life. Augustine is central to multiple Christian traditions because his writings feed theology, preaching, and spiritual formation. The Augustinian family, communities shaped by his rule and spirit, has a global presence, and in places where they serve, often through schools, parishes, formation houses, and social outreach, Augustine becomes not merely a historical figure but a living patron whose story is told and retold. Even beyond Catholic circles, Anglican and Protestant theology has long engaged Augustine's ideas about grace, the human heart, and the nature of the church. So his influence leaks into sermons, teachings, discipleship programs, and theological education in ways many people feel without even noticing his name. And here's the final twist, the one that makes the Nigerian connection feel less like history class and more like a heartbeat. Augustine's life is Nigeria's kind of story. Not because Nigeria is morally worse or better than anywhere else, but because Nigeria is alive with intensity. Augustine's story is not gentle. It's not tidy. It's not polite. It's desire and shame. It's ambition and collapse. It's truth fought for in public while temptation prowls in private. It's a mother praying like a warrior. It's a brilliant mind discovering it can be its own worst enemy. It's a city under siege. It's an old man clinging to mercy, not to reputation. When Nigerians honor Augustine, they aren't just honoring an intellectual. They honor an African voice that refuses to lie about human weakness and refuses to despair about God's strength. They honor a saint who didn't float above the mud, but walked through it and came out speaking a language that still works when your world is shaking. So if you think Augustine's story ends in Hippo with a sickbed and a siege, look again. His body stops. His words don't. Somewhere in Nigeria right now, someone is reading a line that sounds like it was written yesterday, that the heart is restless until it rests in God. Someone is wrestling with shame and finding courage in his honesty. Someone is hearing in a sermon the echo of his war against pride. Someone is choosing unity over division, grace over performance, faith over panic. And the pear thief, hands once sticky with stolen fruit, still reaches across centuries, not to excuse your darkness, but to pull you out of it.